Welcome to Listen In with Sunaparanta. I'm very pleased to have with us today Bijoy Jain. Bijoy Jain studied architecture in Bombay and the University of Washington in St. Louis, Missouri. He worked in Los Angeles and London before returning to India in 1995, where he went on to found Studio Mumbai. His studio operates as an interdisciplinary group of architects, engineers, artisans, master builders, technicians, and artists between India, Europe, and Japan. As a collective, they're involved in the research and development of projects, using process and time as an integral part of their expression. Bijoy Jain's work has been presented at the Venice Biennale and the V&A Museum in London. His work has won several awards, including the Global Award in Sustainable Architecture, the BSI Swiss Architecture Award, the Design for Asia Award, and the Grand Médaille d'Or from the Academy of Architecture in Paris. He is also a professor and has taught at the Yale University as a Norman R. Foster Visiting Professor and the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture. He currently teaches at the Academy of Architecture in Mendrisio in Switzerland, among other things. Thank you so much, Bijoy, for making the time to be with us today, and we're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking to you. So thank you.
I wanted to start by asking you how architecture came to find you, because you come from a family of doctors. At one point of time, you swam for India. So what made you want to be an architect, and how did architecture find you?
To be honest with you, when I saw my family and I saw the hours they were putting in, I was very clear that I did not want to be a doctor. And little did I know that this is what I would be doing to some extent, less so now. But I think it happened more intuitively. I was clear that that's not what I wanted to do. Engineering, law, I mean, these were things that we did when we were young. It was like a propaganda that you do this X, Y, and Z. And so for me, it was more something that I just sort of, just followed a sense, if you want to call it that. And for me, what was good was it happened at the time, a transition when I was slowly, in a sense, my swimming and all of that was receding, and I found something that filled that space. So yeah, it's something that I think it's more intuitive. But to be honest with you, that's what often my decisions come from, trusting that intuition, even though there are no answers or there are no solutions, to the questions of, what if and all of that. And I think over time, that's the experience that I've learned from, that somehow it, through sort of mountain climb and streams and rivers and all of that, you sort of find your way, but or continue to find or search for something. But yeah, that's for me what architecture was. I think also influenced by a lot of travel as a young lad. 3 months every year we would take time out, and for me those are the sort of imprints that somehow have stayed in a sort of conscious, subconscious sort of way. I think just more spatially. So yeah, for me it was something that happened more intuitively, I would say.
How in that process did you develop your sensibilities, which are quite visceral sensibilities, and a sense of language, which is quite different from our traditional understanding of building or a built environment, of architecture even?
Okay, first, what is traditional? Because if you take the root of traditional, then there's a sort of length of time. But if you're looking at something that's more immediate and that has become the norm, I think the word here, the operative word is, what is the norm more than the tradition? Because then there's a whole different set of conditions that you have to respond to answer your question. For me, it was, I was in the US and then sometime in Europe. And also it's important, I left at a very sort of particular time. I was quite young, 18, 19, I had a situation here at home, where I had my entire family had passed away. And so it was something that, it was sort of a provocation to move to something else, just not so much of getting away, but to sort of discover other things. And at some point, this was a decision I had made that if I come back, I would like to be in a sort of more of a rural condition, like more of a rural atmosphere, not from anything else, but because I grew up in a city, as you know, 1960s, independent, India just become independent. Uh, you know, my parents were professionals, so within our culture, there's so many layers and layers and layers, and that's just one facet of something that is multifaceted. And for me, it was more to expose myself to something that I would, you know, to really understand or get a sense of what uh, the other possibilities that were there. So again, me coming back was, you know, at some point to practice yoga. That was one of the things, though I'm not a big practitioner, to be honest with you. Uh, so it was a sort of series of things at that time that sort of brought me back. Uh, and I think the language somehow was sort of a process that unfolded. You know, it was just like you take one step and then the other step, and that's how it sort of unfolded. There was no agenda, manifesto, but I can definitely say one thing, that when I came back, so I was, you know, basically conditioned in a what is called a modernist, you know, ideology or an environment, and I'm not no uh, sort of judgment or sort of observation to that, but that's one thing that I had experienced. But when I came here or when I traveled, there were many other things that one, you know, made contact with, and there was a sense of intimacy that somehow was outside that, you know, was outside this, you know. But again, that's more, I think it becomes at a certain point, anything that starts off as an idea, at some point becomes like a propaganda. And I'm not saying that it's a modernism is a propaganda, but I think that's what, you know, there are these tenets written and then we begin to, so for me, I think the question that was provoked in myself was, you know, why can I not, you know, I'm drawn to this work. And so the first works that I did were, it was a house I was doing, you know, on this in Alibag, my first project. I'd sort of spent 6 months drawing up these plans, and, you know, I'd just come back uh, and I gave these set of drawings to the people that were going to build it, and they just looked at me with a blank face, and they, you know, they had no idea. They don't read drawings, you know. So I said, okay, let's just take this because I have to build with these guys. And honestly speaking, 5 years out of architecture school, I mean, there might be people who know how to build, but I was just starting out. I really didn't know how to build. So part of what it was sort of in submission to the environment, you know, of what's present, what's there, how we can communicate with each other, what is the language that we can use, you know, gestures, movements, drawings, whatever they might be, or, you know, or stories for that matter. And so we actually built a whole project which had nothing to do with those set of drawings. And it all came from this idea of, okay, where are we all collectively going to make the first mark? And we sort of had to agree upon that. Okay, this is the first mark, and then everything then developed from there. But they were, you know, adept builders. I mean, they knew how to build, you know, from foundation up. So, and they could traverse, you know, masonry, carpentry, all kinds of things. So they had that sort of, you know, viscerally in them, which is what you see. I mean, when you think of our landscape in particular, like the Indian, you know, more than 50% is built in that manner. There's a sort of visceral aspect. I mean, millions and millions of people, you know, given our population, that construct their own space or their own sense of architecture. I mean, our built landscape is built outside the framework of what I'm trained to do professionally, when you think about that. So for me, the curiosity was, you know, to understand why this was in some way, I don't want to say left behind, but why something replaced it in such a sort of specific way. I mean, yeah, Europe, there was a war, there had two wars, you know, there was Corbusier and Kant. We had no wars, you know. Yeah, it was the industrial age. So it was so more to sort of question, you know, why have we not a nostalgic one, but more something that was, you know, viscerally connected. And that's why I use the word intimacy. There was a sort of intimate connection to what I experienced in the landscape. And that was the real journey that sort of is unfolding. I'm not saying unfolded, is unfolding. And it's a process. It's for me, it's still a process of things that I'm only discovering, you know, even now. So yeah, and what I think what's transpired in this is that how do we build a bridge? This idea of, not so much past, not about the future, but something about how do we build a sort of a conduit of communication over different sets of time, in some way that you can seamlessly move from one space to the other without having to be this, or this. And I think that's what I've discovered in that there was an opportunity that I was not aware of, and there was it's like a third space that is open. It's not this, it's not that, but maybe something else. And I think for me, it's interesting because I think when, you only learn when you discover. And we were talking about that. Once you've discovered, it becomes knowledge, that's knowledge then, right? And then you build on that knowledge. But how do you have this continuous process of discovery? Because in that, there's a sort of flow, of learning, of an ebb and a flow. For me, I'm interested in that, this idea of, anticipating, being in anticipation. You sense it, but you don't really know it's all quite there. And it's, and I think one way I can describe this idea is if you imagine a diver deep into the sort of depths of the ocean where it's dark, with a little torchlight, and then he sees a sort of shimmering, flickering thing that passes by, and then he continues to hold, or she continues to hold that torch steady, and then that there's a sort of longer period that shimmering sort of stays in the light, and then in some way it eventually reveals itself, so it's that the object and the viewer, and the viewer and the object. I mean, that there's a sort of a relationship in that, and sometimes it's about waiting, and that's what I mean by anticipation, that you have to sort of anticipate the possibility, or anticipate a sense, because intuition provokes that. It's our skepticism that gets the better of our intuition.
And when you come to projects that you're doing, can you talk about that sort of restraint in your work, in embedding that potential that probably only time unfolds? The secrets within spaces that can be seen on repeated viewing, or maybe over time. How do you navigate that?
I think for me, my interest lies more in the fleeting, there's a moment that you capture. How long it stays steady, that's not in my control, right? Yeah. But to allow for a space that can anticipate that moment of fleeting, I think that's what is my sole pursuit. I would say that, it's there, but the length of time is something that remains unknown. And but to go back, if to go back to your question, for me, this idea of economy of means, I mean, number one, we have abundance of material. So for me, architecture for me is built with air, water, light, not with big brick, stones, and wood. That for me is, tangential. It's there. It's, that's a given. That's, but what constructs it, or what builds it is, how do you contain that in a space? So that's really the material that's breathing. I like the idea of economy of means, because one of the things that I discovered, I learned, and that was also a process, but going back, when I was starting off with a tiny space, which was no more than 3 feet by 5 feet. I think it was a laundry room, a bath. I mean, it's some really tiny little project. But what I discovered was that the guys I was working with, they always had a faster and a better way, every single time, if you suggested that. And so for me, that was a process of, and what I was observing was they were maintaining their body and the movement of their body in the most minimum way, that the more they exerted themselves, the more energy they'd have to spend, but so I had a couple of people that I discovered, I have someone here who works that way, where just the radius of his arms, like the back, that's the sort of space they would make. And they would operate within that space of everything. They would sit, they would use their hands, their feet, all, the belly button. It was a sort of a gesture where everything was engaged. And for me, that was the idea of, finding an economy of means of, speed, time, distance. Not just about, and it's not so much about materiality of, trying to save the world or trying to, preserve something, or, it was not that. I think the preservation was more internal, the preservation of the energy expended. So the idea of, I think this idea of space comes from calibrating energy, as a sort of complex whole, more ontological, if I may use that word. It's not just uh, it's not just man and material. So I say that man in material, material in man, or man in nature, nature in man. So for me, that is really the framework, or the operating space from where we are able to make space. And building is just so whether I mean, for me, the studio, for example, is the most important, because every day the studio changes. There's this change, not to change it because it has to be changed, but every day there's a movement, because you can organize something, or you can arrange a set of things in n number of different ways, depending what that condition is. So it doesn't have to be static, it's a moving space. And for me, that's the practice. It's a continual practice, like a riyaz, it's about, that idea of practicing, making space. So I call architecture not, it's not about making buildings, but it's about making space where seemingly there is no space. If I've answered your question, but anyway.
You have, and you've actually touched on two things that I'd love to unpack a little bit. One is, your idea of your practice being like riyaz. So it's something you do every day, if I understand correctly, whether you have a project or not. So it's not built, necessarily with a purpose of, it's more like a laboratory, in my understanding.
I think the laboratory is something that comes later. I think the space allows the opportunity to enter into a dialogue with myself, with the environment that's around me, with the materiality that's around me, which is myself, and everything else that's included, right? And so for me, it's the opposite. Yeah, it's like a musician would, has to practice. Does their practice, or for that matter, a mathematician, or a writer. I mean, it's the same thing. It's this, and for me, it's not about having work, because this is the work. That other work is ancillary to this work, at least for me. Right? So whether because that will come and go. I mean, it's all, and I mean, I spoke about like Piero della Francesca, when he was a fresco painter, I think 13th century, in a place called San Sepolcro in Tuscany, that region. So, and I will touch upon that story, but what I'm saying is that for me, the importance is the practice, not so much the end goal, not so much the getting there. And that's how I refer to it as time. That it's also about being, the practice of being still. For me, that's really what the studio, so that you can see things unfold when they're unfolding. And you have to be in that space to watch them unfold. Otherwise, if you're not there, and that's still, you cannot see them unfold. So for me, the studio is about that, because very subtle shifts, they can be very subtle nuances or subtle shifts. And in that, there could be like a vast amount of space. I'm just, I mean, there's a good friend of ours, Viren, and, for him, that discipline, his pencils are sharpened, the lead, and he's probably here listening. But for me, that's his riyaz, whether he makes it or not, that's what he does. That's the origin of the work. There's a story, he's found something, 10 years ago, and that sort of slowly accrues. It's like a palimpsest that develops, but not just a palimpsest of the object itself. It's a palimpsest of many experiences from that moment that thought came into being.
And I do want to go back to the idea where you talked about materials, and that for you, materials are water, air, light. And could you talk about that a little bit? Because when the last time we met in Goa, we were walking around, and you told me that a rock is just a rock. It's not anything until a hand touches it and then uses it to do something. And the material has to communicate itself as well, or enter that
I
conversation?
think like anything, no, everything and anything communicates. No, I mean, this is something just, scientifically, let's say, and, through archaeologically, anthropologically, right? There was a moment in time, let's, if I took China, I took the Alps, I took Japan, you took India, and let's say building the mountain region, right? And if you really look at buildings at a certain time, so when you say there's a consciousness, there's a material consciousness, that how did we acquire the skills collectively across continents, and then we didn't have the facilities that we have right now, right? But it also required a certain ethos, that relationship, that a fondness, or some way, uh, and so the materials have a way of communicating back of how they have to be handled, you know, just like a child, no? So how do you handle it? You're, you're when children are born, we automatically touch them. I mean, for me, the idea of affection, that was it. The first gestures of that communication came from our hands, because that's the first time that transfer took place. And no, I'm not nostalgic about the hand in that way. And I'm very curious that what would happen if we had no hands. What would happen to affection? And I mean it, because when someone touches you, just a caress, it communicates a lot. So for me, I think these are the things that, what motivate actions, what motivate participate, what motivates that action to take place. And the idea that, so, I mean, coming back, I didn't complete that, you would find similar methods of construction, similar methods of how materials were moved. Yeah, the final expression, there might be a nuance to that, but that's language, that's this language based on climate, based on, food, based on, the colors that are there, that final expression. But if you look at the core structures, they're identical. So for me, it's, and one of the things that I have someone that I work with, we've now been working about 25, 30 years. He's he's 85. He doesn't need to work. He's a stonemason, and working with stone is hard, to move a big rock, then to turn it around, right? But when he sees stone, he doesn't see it as stone. He sees what's the potential of what's waiting inside, what's latent in the stone, and that's his participation of how he comes in contact with it. He made me he's done this beautiful turtle, but there's a very subtle nuance where he sort of describes just the head of the turtle outside the shell, kind of looking slyly to the right. And it's a very beautiful gesture, and that, he sees that in a rock, the potential of that rock. So I'm just saying, for me, that it's something that's lying there latent, waiting to make contact. And that's materiality for me. And that's not bounded by man, and that being outside of man.
So this idea of kind of internality and externality that is so intrinsic to a lot of the spaces that you create, how do you how do you enable this space in between, which is also the title of today's talk? And, for you, that space in between things is quite important. So how does, can you tell us about where that comes from? Because you and I had this conversation about Lucio Fontana and his cuts and, that space between, and Leonard Cohen as well. So if you could just talk a little bit about that space and, what it means.
I think a space in between for me is a space where there is no prejudice. No, it's a space. It's a suspended space. It's not here. It's not there. It's in some sense in levitation. If I mean, it's a suspended space, and that's why I say fleeting. It's there. It's still. But it's moving at such at such a high rate of, what do you say, oscillation or velocity, because we were talking about time, like, moving this way, but you always come back to zero. So it's how often you come to the center that appears that you're in the center. It's not that you're not moving, but the rate at which, or the rate of, or resonance or oscillation or velocity of that resonance or vibration is what gives you that sense of seemingly being suspended. And that's all. I guess we're all seeking that in some way, this sort of, it's that brief moment of pause, where you're sort of everything is, you're in tune in some ways to everything. You don't have to know everything. You don't need to, of course, that's our logical mind that wants to then prescribe and inscribe and sort of document and, archive it and all of that. But yeah, for me, it's that idea of a fleeting moment. To the viewers, it's more, I've just put these together more as a provocation or an evocation of things that have been there on my mind, you know, uh, so I mean, maybe we can go straight to that Pocket Man just as or I can let me read the questions and I'll just start with that and then we can go back. So I mean, this was actually for something else. A friend of mine had, I had a lecture yesterday with the university and they, about a question and answer. And, actually these questions emerged after the lecture. So anyway, so I'm just going to, why can we not live without water? There's no, why can we not be fluid like water when we are made from water? Why do we see inside and outside as two separate entities? What if they are one? Why can we not live without prejudice? Why is gravity equanimous to us? Why do we seek finality and not the space in between? And yet, why do we resist our finality when we know gravity is acting on us? It will prevail after all, or then maybe not. So I've just kind of put these questions, not so much to look for an answer, and I've put some images together that evoke, they just sort of evoke a sort of a kind of an atmosphere that talks about water and prejudice. I mean, but not directly. I mean, they're not like answering the questions. And maybe we can just like scroll through this slide very quickly.
Sure, but Bijoy, can I ask you to talk, you have this very central theme of water in all of your projects, which is, and I have a quote from you which says that, at root, all your projects are about water, the presence of water or the absence of water, or even the search of water. So why water, and, how does it become such an intrinsic part of each one of your projects?
I think this is one of the things that I discovered. So first, just very fundamentally, I mean, our makeup is that, right? I say that we are triangulated with us in between, that is the sun and the moon and us, that's the triangulation that we're making, right? And our ebb and flow, our fluctuation is based on the gravitational pull of the moon. We know that, right? These are certain things. If water is taken out from us, we cease to exist. It's just very fundamental. But one of the things that I discovered was, and actually this was something when I was in a rural part of the country, where, and this, growing up, we'd normally turn our taps on and water comes to us. This was sort of, when we got colonized and the lakes were then made into lakes so they could collect, etc., etc. But if you think about a large part of our population, and I'm not getting into the pedantics of, sustainability and erosion and all of that, because that's a separate, but what has enabled us to come this far, right? And is that what is a piazza to Rome, right, is a water tank to us. That's the central space of any community and always has been, through time. I mean, even now, for example, Mylapore, which is in Chennai, the center of Chennai is actually Mylapore. That was the heart of the city. That's the origin of the city. Of course, then we have Chandigarh, where water takes on a different role altogether. And I think this connection is very primordial. It's a very primordial, very fundamental connection that has somehow been embedded in our space, in our spatial, in the way that we have understood space. And I'm talking about in this continent particularly, right? That there's a very strong relationship to this idea of water. I mean, when you think of, and I would say that this is across, all various different cultures that have a set of practices, but the root is always water. And for me, that's something that, and without water, we cannot exist. So what I'm calling that is the foundation. That for me, the interest is setting in a space the possibility of that foundation, not for anything else, that it allows a possibility of continuity. And one is interested in continuity, that what can I how can I participate in a way that I can embed something that allows a possibility that even I don't know, for civilizations that are not born yet, I don't know. So for me, that really is the sort of at the core, at the very core, it's our being, if I would call it that. That's what allows us to resonate. No, that's what gives us energy in the sense of, that's what gives us sort of vibrational field. So for me, that it's very strong. I mean, that for me, I would like to do, and so buildings also, or whatever, the things that I'm doing, somehow this idea of materiality connects me back to that the origin of these things has somehow been embedded in the nature of the idea of water. And again, water has like three states, solid, liquid, and gas. From mass to transparency, from density to weightlessness. I mean, it has the ability to move in that way, which means that we should have that ability to move in that way too, if that's what makes us.
Thank you. That I love when you talk about water, but I won't interrupt your slides so we can get.
No. And the slides for me are just like a,
We can get to your pocket man story, which is also a lovely story about.
Anyway, just very quickly, the reason I wanted that particular slide above, and when it's actually, these pictures are taken from a very close colleague of mine who lives in Surat, gentleman named Mithul Desai. And so we share, and he's out there in the landscape doing these incredible pictures. So can you go back to the first slide what there's, you can see a sense of a foundation. This is, I think everyone knows that it could be anywhere on one of the banks of our rivers. But I love this. I like the posture, the gesture he's making, these sort of stretched out arms. And it kind of reminds me of the Da Vinci Man, but in the inverse. It's, there's a slight difference. And then also the other person who's there next to him, there's a sort of gaze, or a sort of visual feel, or sort of like a triangulation that's taking place. But also this idea that he's sort of suspended. He's like on, he's sort of suspended on this layer of water. So for me, it's sort of interesting, just how this picture's been shot. And then that's, a hex and an octagon, the circle, a square. It's literally in that field. So just a happen chance. I think this is on the banks of the Ganges, I think somewhere in Banaras. But for me, that was what was captivating about this picture, of how it encompassed that idea of dimension or scale. And that's what, for me, was why I'm showing this picture. We'll go to the next one. Very quickly, I'll do this very quickly. And we have like a sort of in-house studio dictionary that, that is a kind of evolving dictionary, of course, and these words are slightly adjusted. So this is the horizontal angular distance of a celestial object measured clockwise around the observer's horizon from north. Just sharing that. So this is Pocket Man, and we were talking about prejudice, and I find, and this idea of the space in between. And this was, I think, this was in Rajasthan. I was traveling to Nagaur some time ago now. I bought these pitchforks just out of interest for these sort of artifacts, or these agriculture objects, or these, and if you look at it, it's a perfect extension of a hand, even the way that it's got this leather and then it's tied, just the sort of the way that we've made an instrument or a tool that sort of it becomes an extension of the body, if you look at that. So anyway, that was my curiosity. And most of the guys out there were selling this, were dressed in a, classic bandi, the white bandi, linen, cotton bandi dhoti. And this gentleman to the right was the only character there. And of course, I happened to pick the pitchfork that this guy was selling. So I'm with him, chatting with him, and I sort of asked him, how come you're the only guy here in this canary yellow T-shirt? And he says, Jamana, like, that. He says that we get these T-shirts for free. These traveling salesmen come and, give these T-shirts for free. Now, logically, yeah, it makes sense. Climatically, cotton, T-shirt, even the gesture of the T-shirt is not that similar from the bandi anyway. And I'm then handing him the money, and he's kind of sitting down, so I can't see the front. And then he kind of puts his hand in his T-shirt, and that's when I sort of, this picture has been revealed. And so I said, damn, how did you do this? And so he said, no, I just took it home. My wife cut it, and she stitched this sort of pink satin or a pink cloth, which must have been at home, and she lined the pocket. For me, the reason I show this picture is that, we're all in this constant, I think, remorse, and maybe remorse, that we're losing our tradition, we're losing, we're always, there's a loss, there's a loss of some kind. And our energy is spent in, this loss that, for me, what I find interesting is that there's no judgment made of a juggernaut that is approaching this field, and that's what I mean by stillness, where there's no prejudice here about what's coming in, and the ability that all of it can coexist. So what seemed to be no space, given from some other point of view, that there's no space, this is going to be, completely rolled over. Right? He's been able to find or expose a space which was seemingly not there. And for me, that's what I find fascinating about this particular gesture that's been made by this artifact, if I want to call it that. That it allows for the possibility of a third, where you can see all of it coexisting, but coexisting in a harmonious way, with some sense of grace. I think the operative word can be grace. There's still a gracefulness in the way that it's presented. And for me, this is the opportunity that I'm curious about. It's about this sort of palimpsest that comes together. And what can then occur from that? How do you find a space where there is no space, or seemingly no space? And this is a good example of how I would see that.
So it's one of my favorite stories that you tell, but I would love to get to gravity as well, and how you treat, sorry.
I'll just slide through that, yeah. This is again, this rock I'd taken a while ago in Hampi, and I just took it as just beautiful, like it was sculpture as far as I was concerned. I didn't even know what those holes were at that time. I just took the picture. I just found it fascinating. And what this was actually was they made these holes in the rock. They would drive wooden pegs. They would pour water on the wooden pegs. The wood would expand and basically split the rock. So you only had a chisel, a hammer, wood, and some water. And they've constructed an entire city not so long ago, 500 years ago, in Hampi, and many places like this within our continent and even elsewhere. So talk about economic means, and talk about gravity, where there is no space, it's just pure mass, pure rock. That they're able to find that gap. And there are many different ways, like you can use the ear, the sound, depending on the geology. And this kind of gives you a sense that this is the landscape and the immediacy of the landscape, right? And for me, this is still contemporary. This still, we're still building this way. Mm-hmm. Even in Rajasthan, and there are parts that we still build this way, or we can build this way. So it's not something that is of another time. It's present to us. And this slide, that the image on the left, where you see this ramp, and it's again that idea about prejudice, and where the motorcycle or the scooter now is a prized possession of this family. Aspiration, things that move, and how the architecture also begins to get influenced by that movement, right? But you don't see the origin of which one came first, just this idea of a palimpsest that you can see in the picture, right? You don't know which one came first. And it's not even suggesting that it is required for a motorcycle, right? It can be for a number of different things. For me, these are what I see in the landscape. There are these, and I'm not calling this jugaad. That's very different. It's not invention. It's not, it takes on a different kind. Even the way they've rendered it, the white, the way that travels. Why do you need to do that, right? Why do you have to do that? What motivates you to do that? And for me, that's what we're talking about: prejudice, gravity, affection. Let's go to the next slide.
How do you keep your mind open to this and not kind of, have that prejudice? So how do you stay away from having it? I remember you told me how you wanted to once build a wall, but you didn't want to use any concrete. And so you thought of using, I want to say laterite, but I could be wrong.
Well, no, that's big. They're called, in Goa, they're called Gadaga walls.
Right.
It's basically dry stack walls. I have them here in the studio. Now, it was just happen chance. And this is something I've known by, being in the landscape, traveling in the landscape, and there are people, and it's funny, it's done everywhere, not just here, from Greece, from Japan, and over continents, this is still done. It's not that it's not, it's something of the past. So it was not so much no to concrete or yes to, it was just that there was an immediacy. It was all there, so I can just harness what is there. It's just, you know, putting the two together, and then the amount of energy spent to what input to output, right? It's that. So that's what I'm saying: speed, distance, velocity. How do you traverse time in the shortest, shortest time? How do you travel distance in the shortest time? And that's, for me, the sort of preoccupation. Uh, Constellation, a group of stars on the celestial sphere forming a pattern traditionally named after its apparent form. An assemblage, collection, or group of usually related entities, qualities, or things. And it's a beautiful picture. I mean, again, I only discovered, I mean, by putting this picture, but this was only this evening that I saw this sort of relationship, which I was not even aware of. I was just looking at something else. And so things also have a way of unfolding. It was just in this text. Why this text came to this picture was, again, just things just happened to find their way. Manner, from the French manière, substantivized use of the adjective, meaning done with one's hands. A notion which reveals a method of execution or a way of doing, especially with regards to the outward manifestation of an embodied process. Just something I want to say, we see people working here, and especially in our, and we see them working with their hands and feet. So we're talking about economy of means, speed, distance, time, right? They're using their body and the amount of pressure to, with their feet, with their hands, it's all so finely calibrated, that's the kind of contact. I mean, that's the kind of intimacy. The heart is closest to the object because that's the space. I mean, we've seen people across our landscapes work like that, and we pass them every day, right? But for me is it's a very powerful position or gesture in the act of making, that the entire body, the entire posture. I mean, I remember Akbar Padamsi used to, talk about it. I was a little kid at that time, this idea of posture and the importance of posture in painting, and how he talked about that for 3 hours, just, the stance that one takes, when one paints. And so it's about the space that is in between, not the space of what you touch or what's touching you, but what's sort of in between that becomes, I think, critical. And the beautiful pictures, the posture, the word comes from the Latin verb ponere, which means to put or place. To observe this concept implies an implicit understanding of the carriage of the body as a whole, its approach, attitude, or the positioning of the arms and legs in relation to the object which is being manipulated. And again, this picture is not, it's not a kind of nostalgic or a tourist picture, but this idea of relationships, of layers of relationship and the energies that flow. Right? Mm-hmm. So I'm also kind of referring back to a certain culture that is not, that we had a certain relationship with our landscape and how we were able to, transmit or transfer those relationships between one another. I think that's at play. For me, those are the questions that I'm curious about, because those will always be the questions that, at least for me, have to be, because there will always be evolution. There will always be some erosion. There will be this sort of, cut and fill is the best way I can say that. Like we're going through a cut and fill right now. Just globally as an idea. Of mass and density and volume and weight. And all of that. So for me, it's kind of embedded in a sort of more complex sort of relationship of what is the meaning of posture. It's also a metaphorical idea of the idea of posture, not just a physical one. Yeah, and this idea of what's inside and outside, can that be one? And I'm showing this through an architecture, through a building. For me, this is a building. Right? Concrete and steel is not the only way to make buildings, right? These are other ways to make buildings. But this idea of, where does that boundary lie? How fine is that boundary for things to pass through? Where you kind of experience, while you're protected, you have a sense of still being, open to the environment.
That's like you always say you love courtyards. You love that it's open to the sky and that, that internal, external kind of existence.
Yeah, it's more that a sense of being held. Who, who would not want to be held, just, to be just held? And for me, the idea or the suggestion of that is more this idea of just being just held. Irreverie of a state or entity which has the character of a dream, but which is rooted in reality. So for me, it's a very enigmatic image, the way that it's come together. So talk about inside and outside, angle of repose, gravity, So these are sort of describing how that, something that is ephemeral, that's liquid in a way, it's cloth, and how that begins to take on a sense of structure and volume and, all of that, a sense of materiality, which is, so where does this materiality lie? And you can see how just in that one, so sometimes, for me, most often limits are good, If freedom is not doing anything and everything you want, that's not freedom, Freedom, how do you find freedom when there are limits? How do you find space? So finding space is finding a sense of that, what we're alluding to, this idea of freedom, because it allows you a place to breathe, right? If gravity played its, part, I'm not saying that's not what it wants to do to us, but that's just one of the inbuilt sort of, it's coded that way, right? It's coded both ways for us to breathe, and there's a moment in time when we cease to breathe, right? So I'm just saying that these are all sort of finely woven in a sort of, as an idea of materiality, of space, of inside and outside, of, I think, classically, if you like, one of the things I've always questioned, this was I think in Mysore, Srirangapatnam, there was this incredible temple, and there's the Garbhagriha, and if you've noticed, in South India, for me, they're like these, flying objects that have come and kind of landed on Earth. They're just incredible, just the way that they've been built. But I've always questioned the notion of the Garbhagriha, and of course, after many years, of reflecting on that, and is the light, it's this idea of internal light that we have to work to keep. So is the light coming from outside, or is the light being emitted from the inside? When you ask that, in what is the most sacred space, so it's for me, it's a perfect representation of that architecture. And I don't want to give it, give any symbolism of what it alludes to today. I'm just thinking, for just purely to examine its metaphorical, scientific in every which way, that there's this mass, above your head, which is all mass, and it's gravity basically pushing down. And then there's a tiny little space, that is kept illuminated. And that's the space of, and I think for me, that idea of, inside and outside comes from that where is the light really? Right? So if I say that, what if the sky is a mirror reflection of the earth? Because you require distance to see something. Yeah. If you need to see something and you want to look back at yourself, you require distance. So for me, that idea of the stars, or this idea of astronomy, and the idea of what we see above us, right, is reflective of, and is the light, so the light that we see above, is a reflection of the earth, because light in Mumbai or Bombay, light in Goa where you are, light in Delhi or light in Madrid is affected, because light doesn't just hit the surface and go back. It penetrates deep inside, like it goes inside, it sort of seeps into the earth, and that's what's being reflected back. So there's a whole other sense of materiality that doesn't even meet the eye, but we're able to see it. We're able to sense it, Anyway, sorry, I've kind of...
No, but you talk about that idea of, how Jeffrey Bava influenced your practice a lot. And you have, I think it was in the Aga Khan lecture you gave, that you said, he said that there's too much architecture between me and the view.
Yeah, I thought that was a very powerful
Can
moment.
you explain that a little bit?
So, okay, the best way I can describe that is, you know, to look at buildings or look at architecture in the way that we are conditioned to think about that, you know, but to look at it as landscape or terrain and not as building, because, you know, how I modulate myself in a space, right? In the way that, like steps, you know, you could move vertically in many different ways, fast steps, slow steps, long steps, and that has an impact on your physical structure, your thighs, your muscles, you know, what you see, how you move, except, you know, where your focus would be. So there's, you know, just let's say if I just had to describe steps or staircases, you know, in a space, it's like walking on a hill or a mountain, right? Or a flat plane. Each one suggests a sort of different rhythm and time, right? There's a sort of different kind of energy, but it also has a direct impact on your physicality too, which has then an impact on or influences the experience of what you're going through, right? And for me, this idea that, you know, it was because we were at the front porch of his house, and, you know, and he was pruning some branches of some trees in the distance, and he was kind of waving out that man had to kind of shake the branch, and then he would make that, and and so he just kind of gestured. But I just found that very enigmatic, that idea of there's too much architecture between me and the view. But what was very beautiful about that, we were on the architecture. We were on in this. So we're actually immersed in that space. It's just one of the many things, and not the only thing. And for me, that's my interest in, you know, making buildings that they're more landscape for me than buildings, even if they're just, you know, column beam. I mean, it doesn't mean that it has to have this sort of, you know, it's what it provokes or what it suggests as an experience, you know. So when you say something is, I would say discrete is, you know, that if you've considered every possible gesture of how one inhabits a space, right, from the way you move to a door handle to the way you eat. I mean, let's say if that, there's a moment where, like, for example, when, you know, food is made by your grandmother, mother, you know, friend, whatever. I mean, just saying, you know, we've all had these experiences, right? And it's not food anymore, right? It sort of takes you into another kind of dimension where the materiality of those ingredients is not important anymore. It's suggested. So in some sense, I would say it recedes. It sort of takes a back step, right? And for me, that idea that, you know, the way we sit, the postures we take, you know, the idea of postures, that the postures we take, that when we move through a space, they become sort of relevant. And how do you make a space inclusive for a diversity of postures that we can, you know, that allow us to inhabit that space?
You spoke about two things which I'd like to touch on. One, which is gestures, and then there's stairways. You know, you talked about a staircase or building stairs. And I know you've talked often about generosity when it comes to creating spaces. And, you know, how do you translate that? And you were once talking about the tread of stairs. Could you talk about how generosity or gestures translate into spaces?
So right here, these are pictures that best suggest that, and it's got nothing to do with me, which I actually like, right? I mean, with the most minimum means, you know, I mean, to be wrapped in this, you know, it's a gossamer, lights pass. I mean,
The angle of repose, the steepest angle at which a sloping surface formed of loose material is stable.
so that's the sort of least amount of energy spent, where it's a kind of resting space. It's a sort of still space. And I like that idea of loose material, is surface of formed of loose material, how you allude to that idea of, you know, in language, uh, or semantics of language, I think. And I'm coming to that idea of generosity, and just coming to that. And here it's like, you know, think about this idea of gravity and opposite, you know, it's evaporation. That very fundamental material is salt. You know, we know the implication of salt culturally for us. You know, when you think of Gandhi and, you know, the things that it's so fundamental. It's so fundamental, right? That there was that whole Dandi march. I mean, this powerful sort of gesture that came from this idea. But it's also just these mounds, but it talks about how ground is emerging up, in its evaporation. How did we discover that this is, you can use that energy to sort of construct these things. This is just, these are lime kilns, just beautiful picture taken by another colleague, Srijaya, who's also part of the studio.
So affection is the ability to observe and to identify with another situation or condition, and then to care for it and protect it in the hope to provide it with what it needs to be itself.
And so that question about generosity, I mean, this is Mark Rothko paintings, when you think about this. And this is that idea of gravity, because the only thing they're doing, what was an opaque space, what is just mud, what is cow, dung, which is, this combination, this is all things that are being compressed over time, right? And our ability to take that and, to shift that, right? You're just taking a surface and you're extruding it up to make a space from that. But for me, this picture best describes this idea of gravity and generosity. All of this comes from water, air, light. All this comes from, gravity, the roof, the materials. And again, I'm not looking at this in a nostalgic way. And funny enough, this Hamlet, if you want to call it that, is going to be taken down. And they're aware that it's going to be taken down, and they're okay with it being taken. I mean, I'm not sure if they're okay or not okay, because there's an airport coming up, but they're aware that they will have to move, but that ability for them to be able to move allows them that freedom, of the way that they interact with the land. Most of us would find it very difficult to do that. And that's the intimacy that they've engaged with, knowing that they have to move. So even though it's temporaneous, they're still participating in this way. I mean, for me, this is, it's Rothko. That's what I'm seeing. Gravity, the force that attracts a body towards the center of the earth or towards any other physical body having mass. And I really like this picture because it's this moment of, two things that are what we might see as in collision, but to see that there's space in between these two very extreme situations. And I'm just going to leave this last slide because for me, we talked about Piero della Francesca right at the beginning. And for me, it's, how it sort of came into my, and I visited this. So this is a picture. And there's this, just to kind of summarize everything, the region of the clouds or the expanse of air over any given point on the earth. Ground, the solid surface of the earth. Earth, the substance of the land surface. Anyway, the reason I'm showing this picture, importantly, was this is a fresco painting done by Piero della Francesca, 13th, 14th century, if I'm correct. That was after Giotto, in a town called San Sepolcro. And there was a beautiful documentary that I came upon just by happen chance. And we're talking about traversing time, we're talking about gravity, we're talking about affection, we're talking, all the things that and also things that are relevant today, like defacing, I mean, all kinds of things, monuments, whatever, blah, all the stuff that's going on. But so this was and Aldo Huxley came upon this picture, and in his travel log that he writes about that he came upon the greatest picture in the world in the town of San Sepolcro. And it was interesting, there was this sergeant, it was World War II, and there was a sergeant, British sergeant, whatever, with his cannons, and they were firing because they thought the Nazis were in the town. And so he opened fire, the first one, and then he came up and remembered that this Aldo Huxley's book that he had read, an erudite, I guess, sergeant, and remembered this sort of line where Aldo Huxley saw the greatest picture in the world in the town, and he got them to stop firing. I mean, this could be him being court-martialed. Anyway, to his fortune, the Nazis were not there, dead left, and they went there and saw this. But the interesting part is that this work has survived 400 years. After it was commissioned, it was defaced by the same people that commissioned this work. So they first commissioned the work and they celebrated the work. And then came the Renaissance, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, that whole world, which was another whole world. And this painting was basically covered with lime. It was defaced, like completely erased. And it was in this town hall. to only be discovered 300 years later in World War I by an American, again, during the war. And he saw some peeling paint and he saw this fresco. So when the war was over, he could sort of returned back after World War I and sort of restored this fresco. And that's when it was discovered. And then all the painters, I mean, that we know, from that period in the 1900s, all have gone and sort of taken a pilgrimage to this particular work, right? So for me, and it's interesting, Piero della Francesca, this was his last work. He went blind after that. He was a mathematician, very young. He died at, if I'm correct, 37 or something like that. Right? But for me, what's interesting about that is how it has been, and it's still intact. It's exactly the way it was when it was then. And it sort of it even creates distance from the iconography that is there. It sort of goes beyond that. And so this idea of, how work can traverse time, how work can traverse prejudice, how work, what has enabled that, and so these sort of words that I've kind of just conjured up in this was for me, just more a provocation of the possibility of, our capacity of what we have, and for me, that's the interest in, doing what I do is how do you allow for longevity, how do you bring longevity, knowing that all these possibilities are there in between. But anyway, this was more to just sort of give a sort of atmosphere, if I want to call it that.
We've been in conversation for over 60 minutes, and, and thank you for giving us your time. But I am going to ask you a few questions which came in from the audience. So the first one here is that how do you pick the right one, and how do you pick perhaps the right material or the right space and transform it into something beautiful? Could you talk about your work in Japan in building an arts village?
Now, beautiful, I don't know. So I'm going to, I think it's sort of so the material that's going to be manipulated, the man that is going to be manipulated by the material. So there are many moving parts, right? It's sort of like many moving parts to that. And it's wanting to find an equilibrium. And I use the operative word here, wanting. I don't know for certain. And it's like you kind of have to have a nose, right? Or a ear. You kind of have to put your ear to the ground. It's like being a tracker, like, trackers, how they track down, or for example, the Irula tribe, the snake tribe, that they can tell you from a blade of grass when the snake left, how long the snake is, where it is, etc., etc., etc. So it's something, then that's what I meant by the idea to be stationary, so you can see these many moving parts. And you're just trying to find a rhythm in them. So I would say it's more like a kind of free jazz, where you also need to play that music. And you can also rightfully ask the question that not everyone is going to be at that level, So how does it become inclusive? So the idea is to find a system that makes the place inclusive, and not so much because that's where there's harmony. It's in that collective set that there is a possibility of some kind of discord or harmony, but that's what will be expressed. Now, whether it's beautiful or not, I think that's a separate thing altogether. Yeah. So for me, it's more, it's like, an equalizer, that you have music that you're playing, there's a sort of equal, and you kind of have all these buttons that are going up and down, like when you see a DJ, it's a question of how all of that, the moment you change one completely, you're going to get a completely different sort of response or feedback, right? So this is it's like the idea of a feedback loop that's, building up. And so I think to set up those moving parts, that they're able to communicate with each other, if I've answered the question. But for me, that's the idea of how to find the optimum. It's more finding an optimum solution. Yeah. Doesn't mean that material has to come from there, or the person has to come from that. Someone can come from a great distance also. So it's not just limited to distance and local and context. Right? So that for me, there's an optimum that you're looking for.
The next one is what are the, I know how much you love questions like this, so I'm going to ask it. What are the three things you think a student should be studying in architecture college to be able to think or create spaces like you do?
I would not ask them to create spaces like I do. I mean, they would like, because there's opportunity.
That's a cop out, Bijoy. You have to answer the
There's
question.
an opportunity. No, I will answer the question. I will answer the question. Okay, so maybe this is what, because when I'm teaching at school, since I teach, right, uh, there my students are allowed to bring anything, right, from a pizza to a piece of music to water to a blank piece of paper or nothing at all, right? And for example, the project brief will be air, water, light. Can birth life make a space where birth, life, and death coexist and are seamless in a seamless space? Right? Varanasi is a great example of that, where you see that condition occurring, unfolding in front of your eyes. I mean, it's this where these conditions all sort of meet, and many other places. And I'm in response to the question. I think you have to make contact with yourself, because we all have language embedded in us in some way or the other. And to be able to open that up, to make a space like me, how can you make a space like me? Because it comes from, it's for me from my stomach, it's coming out of my belly, right? And so to say, oh, I'm going to make a space like, how can I make a space like Jeffrey? No, I have to eventually make a space from where I can make a space. If I can carry 2 bricks, and if I'm making a space with 10 bricks, the impossibility of that, right? I mean, it's not going to meet. Right? So for me, that's not, I think for me that, yeah, that to trust, I was the other day, I think, how do we trust, how do you develop a practice to trust intuition? And for me, that we were saying that my studio is an extension of my studio in university or school. I'm still in school as far as I'm concerned. For me, that was the part that really opened up, is like, wow, you can actually do this and work like this, right? Is to have us, that you can be learning and discovering things every day. So it doesn't stop at university or school. That practice has to continue. And I think tuning yourself to trust your intuition, I think that's where the magic lies. For me personally. So that's what I can share with them, is that's what I can share, that, tune into your intuition and trust it.
The next one comes from an artist I admire greatly and a bookmaker who also takes photographs, Danita Singh, who asks, how important is the image of the work when you are imagining? She says she's intrigued by this close connection between photography and architecture in the way that architecture meets light. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think I can. So one of the projects that I did, I mean, there is something already reverberating within you, right? And I was saying that there's a latent something that is there in a place or a person or people or a situation, right? And it's that what I said, there's a kind of fleeting moment, something exposes itself to you, just like that fish in the deep dark sea, right, with the torchlight. You kind of anticipated that you're going to see. So that's the image that you have, right? But you're not, I mean, it sort of appears, and it appears in a completely different light. So for me, the image is more a sort of, it's a haptic quality to it. When I'm calling it an image, for me, it's more a haptic space. That's the image, that because I can tap into a haptic space, right? And from that I can construct. Okay. Because we experience space from 5 different possibilities, right? Sight, sound, touch, scent, and of course there's one that is there and it's present, and that is not defined, if you want to call it scientifically or logically. There's no logic to why you would respond that way, right? So you could get 100 architects or 100 photographers to shoot. You'll get 100 different pictures or 100 different. You're not going to get the same same thing, right? And I think that's wonderful that there's that possible, because in each one there's an opportunity, that there's space that someone else has not been able to see, or is not present, but it depends where that motivation comes from, right? So for me, the idea of the image, I think, resides in the haptic space, in the repository of the haptic space. It's a repository. And so with that, it's the idea of image as repository, deep repository.
The next one is from somebody referenced earlier, Viren Bhagat, who asks, you have brought such a refined minimalism into your architecture. How do you know when is the correct moment to say stop?
I'm lazy. So that's the best thing. The least amount of movements I can make, that's when I know that, okay, it's done. No, I think stop is just the physicality of something, right? It's the inability to continue to participate with that. Maybe in a physical sense, but in a visceral sense, no, it never stops. I mean, it's something that, and I like to use the word palimpsest, that you build up on it, you build up on it, you build up on it. So for me, for example, the first project I did in school is still living inside me. It's not, I did that and it's over. It's still there, it still breathes, I still experience it, I can call for it anytime, and like this, most things that one does, that one is intimate about, right? It's something that there's a sense of an interaction of all the things that I said, affection, intimacy. I mean, all of that is there. So it's just calling for that. But I think somewhere also I think it's a good question also. I think the place that it goes to my stomach. That's where you have to die. You just kind of, it sits right around the belly button. And I don't know how to describe that, because if you try and sit it here, I know that it's not happening.
I'm going to take one question from a young architecture student, and maybe this is the last one because I know I've taken up a lot of your time at this point. The question is, the book, The Eyes of the Skin, talks about the ocular centrism of modern architecture, architecture designed solely for the eyes, in a way in order to be photographed. How important is it to you that the space needs to be able to be captured in a photograph rather than experienced through the other senses as a whole? This is
okay, so I can answer
your architecture student.
Yeah, so I can answer it from both sides. I'd say that that's just one of the many things. That's not the only thing. So how important? It's as important. I'm not saying, why should I delete that out? Because then that itself becomes. So I'm not. But if that's the only thing I'm chasing, then no, that's not. To be seated, in an angle of repose. Right? I think this idea of the possibility of grace. I'm using the word grace because grace is about well-being. And if one can enter into that, then everything is included, including that picture. If the best way I can respond to that. No, I mean, whenever you chase one thing, there's other things that you might be losing out on. So that's one of the many things, not the only thing. And that's not what motivates it anyway. It's something that occurs. Like anything, like a dancer, a musician, why? It's the same way that we talk about sound, right? When you talk about music, it's about sound.
I want to end with a quote from a lecture you once gave, where you said that the idea we can do things with care, with the greatest amount of empathy, that's really our work. Empathy is what is sustainable. Love is what is sustainable. So if you could address that, and then we can end on that positive note.
There's not much not to, I mean, I think that communicates. I mean, I don't think there's anything to communicate. I think we all know that. And when I say that's our work, yeah, that's our work. How do we remain engaged to evoke that possibility as often as one can? That idea of the center, because the center is there, that's the center. and we are going to reverberate in a field of ebb and flow. We've got gravity, we have water, we've got the tides. We're going to have that movement. And so how do we remain as often as we can in that center is the best, because that's where everything can come together, at least from how I understand it. And so that's the best way I would describe it. It's being truly in contact, right? In full contact, fully exposed, in the sort of not knowing of what is going to unfold, in the unknowing or the unpredictability or the sort of flux of that fluctuation of that ebb and flow. I think that, and so in that question I say, that idea of finality, we seek finality, and yet we don't, and yet we don't move towards that, right? We don't embrace that, in that knowing that gravity will act upon. And then I say maybe not, because there is that space in between.
Thank you, Bijoy, for your time. Sorry, I've taken up more than I requested.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being here and for interacting with our audience and sharing the joy of your genius. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.